Okay, in 2.4 we're going to be looking at conditional statements. And so conditional statement is just an if-then statement. It's just an if-then statement. Okay, now here's the important thing to remember. Just because it's not written in if-then form, if it can be written in if-then form, then it's a conditional statement. So like for example, this statement, dogs are animals, right? So even though it's not written in if-then form, it can be written in if-then form, so that makes it a conditional. If I were to take this statement, dogs are animals, I can write it like this. If it is a dog, then it is an animal. That's if-then form, right? And by the way, when you're using conditional statements, this arrow is implies and it means if-then. And you'll see that in some of the symbolism that we use here in just a minute, okay? And so if it is a dog, then it is an animal. That is a conditional statement. The hypothesis is the if part of the statement, and the conclusion is the then part of the statement, right? Okay, so these conditional words are not included in the hypothesis and the conclusion. So the hypothesis here, it is a dog. The conclusion, it is an animal, okay? Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to learn how to write different statements using the conditional and how they are formed. So the conditional statement, P implies Q. That means if P, then Q. Use the hypothesis and the conclusion to create it. Now remember, P and Q can stand for whatever they want to. In this case, we'll let P be it is a dog, and Q be it is an animal. All right? So that's my conditional. Okay, so we'll go ahead and write out the same conditional. If it is a dog, then it is an animal. Okay? If it is a dog, then it is an animal. Okay? Now, the first thing we want to learn how to write is the converse. Okay? The converse is formed by switching P and Q. You switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if the conventional or the conditional is P implies Q, then the converse is Q implies P. So if my conditional is if it's a dog, then it's an animal, right? Then the converse of that would be if it is an animal, then it is a dog. All right? So that is the converse. Switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. All right? The next thing we want to learn how to write is called the inverse. The inverse is formed by putting not into both the hypothesis and the conclusion. You put not into both of them. No switching, okay? But you put not into both of them. So if my conditional is if it's a dog, then it's an animal, the inverse would be if it is not a dog, then it is not an animal. If it is not a dog, then it is not an animal. That would be the inverse. And the contrapositive is formed by switching and putting not into both. So you switch the hypothesis and the conclusion, then you put not into both. And that's how you would form what is known as the contrapositive. So again, if I take my conditional statement and I wanted to make the contrapositive out of it, I would have to switch it and put not. So if it is not an animal, then it is not a dog. Then it is not a dog. Okay? So again, this is an example of how to form the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Okay, so now let me kind of give you some hints as to how to memorize this. Okay, so converse, All right, remember, converse is formed by switching it. Well, converse is a type of shoes. If your shoes are on the wrong foot, what are you going to do? You're going to switch them. So that's how you form the converse. You switch. Inverse, you put not in to both of them. Put not into both of them. Then contrapositive, you're just going to have to remember it's both. Switch and put not. It's the longest word, so it's both. Do everything. Okay? Converse, shoes on the wrong foot, switch them. Inverse, you put not in to both of them. Right? Contrapositive, you do both. You switch it in, you put not. So that helps you memorize what to do. Okay? Now, let's go through and look at all these statements that we've written and decide whether they are true or false. If it is a dog, then it is an animal. Is that true or false? Well, if it's a dog, then it is an animal. That is true. And remember, for something to be true, it has to be true in all cases. And so sometimes a student will make the argument, well, what if it's a stuffed dog? All right, then it's not an animal. Well, a stuffed dog is not a dog, it's a toy. All right, so that's the difference. If it's a dog, we're talking dog, real dog. All right, so any dog that you have is an animal. If you have a German Shepherd, that's an animal. If you have a pit bull, that's an animal. If you have a Chihuahua, it's an animal. Any dog you have is an animal, always true, no counterexample. All right, what about the converse though? If it's an animal, then it's a dog. All right, so again, the given information is it's an animal. The conclusion is it's a dog. Is that conclusion true or false? Well, if it's an animal, it doesn't have to be a dog. Okay, I could have a cat, I could have an ox, I could have a squirrel. Okay, just because I have an animal doesn't mean it has to be a dog. So all of those would be counterexamples. Squirrel, cat, frog. All right, all of those are counterexamples. Just because you have an animal doesn't mean the animal has to be a dog. Okay? All right, inverse. Let's look at the inverse. If it's not a dog, then it's not an animal. Okay? This statement is also false for the same reason. All right, so if it's not a dog does not mean it's not an animal. You can use the same counterexamples as the last one. Cat's not a dog, but it is an animal. That's a counterexample to show that it's false. All right, what about the contrapositive? If it's not an animal, then it's not a dog. All right, so let's see if that's true. So if I have something that is not an animal, is it also true that it would not be a dog? All right, so let's think about something that's not an animal. Pencil. Pencil is not an animal. Is that a dog? No. TV is not an animal. Is it a dog? No. Computer is not an animal. Is it a dog? No. Table? No. Okay, so is there any counterexample? Is there anything that I could bring that's not an animal, but it is a dog? All right? You cannot. There is no counterexample. If I bring something that's not an animal, it's also definitely not a dog, because a dog is an animal. So that is true. The contrapositive is true because there is no counterexample. There is not anything that I could present that's not an animal that would be a dog. That's how you would have to get a counterexample. All right? So this statement is actually true. Now here's something to remember. Converse and inverse always have the same truth value, and conditional and contrapositive always have the same truth value. So what that means is if the converse is true, the inverse also has to be true. If the converse is false, then the inverse also has to be false. And likewise, they have to match. And likewise, the conditional and the contrapositive also have to match. If the conditional is true, then the contrapositive also has to be true. So these two always match, and these two always match. Okay, so keep that in mind because that is a multiple choice question that a lot of times they like to ask on a test. If the conditional is true, which one also must be true? And it'll say converse, inverse, contrapositive. Well, conditional matches with contrapositive. All right, so make sure that you're aware of those. Some practice problems we want to look at. Okay, directions say write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the statement. All right, so here's the statement. If it is a square, then it has 4 sides. By the way, is that statement true or false? If it's a square, then it has 4 sides. That statement is true because there is no square that you can bring that does not have 4 sides. There's no square that you can find that has 5 sides. Okay? No counterexample, it's got to be a true statement. All right, what do we want to write first? Well, we want to write the converse. Remember, how is the converse formed? Converse, shoes on the wrong foot, switch it. You got to switch the front and the back. So the converse would be if it has 4 sides, then it is a square. If it has 4 sides, then it is a square. Is that true or is that false? If it has 4 sides, then it is a square. Well, let's see if we can bring something that has 4 sides that's not a square. Okay? So if you have a rectangle, then a rectangle, if the sides are not all the same length, then it would not be a square. Okay, so a rectangle would be a counterexample. A rhombus would be a counterexample. A trapezoid has 4 sides. So there's several counterexamples to show that that statement is false. By the way, we will get into a unit that is all about 4-sided figures. So if you don't know the difference between those things I had just mentioned, we will talk about it in depth when we get to that unit. Okay? All right. Inverse. The next thing we want to form is the inverse. How do you form it? By putting not into both of them. So the inverse would be if it is not a square, then it does not have 4 sides. Does not have 4 sides. It does not have 4 sides. Okay? If it is not a square, then it does not have 4 sides. I don't even have to think about it. I know that statement is false because the converse and the inverse have to match. If it's not a square, then it does not have 4 sides. And typically the same counterexamples that worked for a converse will also work for inverse. It could be a rectangle. All right, that's not a square, but it does have 4 sides. Rhombus, it's not a square, but it does have 4 sides, and so on. Last thing we want to form is the contrapositive. We do it by switching and putting not into both. So I need to switch it and put not. If it is, well, no, if it does not have 4 sides, does not have 4 sides, then it is not a square. If it does not have 4 sides, then it is not a square. And I already know that's true because the contrapositive and the original statement have to match. And if you think about it, if it doesn't have 4 sides, then it definitely cannot be a square. All right? So the key thing to get from this lesson is how to form converse, inverse, and contrapositive and to determine whether those things are true or false. Now, one more thing we want to look at here. Okay, so when a statement and its converse are both true, then the statement can be written as a biconditional statement, meaning the statement is true and the converse is true. All right, if both of those are true, then it can be written as a biconditional statement. Biconditional is double arrow, and you read it as if and only if. Okay, so this would be read as P if and only if Q. All right, that means it's true both ways, forwards and backwards. And of course, the backwards would be the converse. So if the statement and its converse are both true, then it can be written as what is known as a biconditional statement. All right, so for example, what about this? If it is 90 degrees, then it is a right angle. If it's 90 degrees, then it is a right angle. True, by the way. If it's 90 degrees, it does have to be a right angle. All right. Then we have if it is a right angle, then it is 90 degrees. Okay, so I just wrote the converse. If it's a right angle, then it is 90 degrees. Also true, by the way. So the statement is true and the converse is true. Okay, so what that means is this can be written as a biconditional statement because the statement is true and the converse is true. So I could write it as a biconditional statement like this. An angle is 90 degrees if and only if it is a right angle. Okay? An angle is 90 degrees if and only if it is a right angle. Okay? And so that is kind of an example of a biconditional statement. That would be your bicondition. All right? So take everything that we kind of learned from this lesson, keep your notes handy with you, and then use that to go through and complete your quiz.